On my 58th birthday, my son sent me a bottle of whiskey. I didn't think much of it at the time, and during a small dinner I ended up giving it to his father-in-law instead. The very next day, my son called and asked me how the whiskey was. I told him I had given it away. There was silence on the line for a moment, and then he shouted at me, "Please stay with me as I tell you my story, and please do not forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones." The gift had arrived in a heavy box, wrapped carefully, with a short note that read, "Happy birthday, Dad." I smiled when I saw it because Daniel remembered. He's 32 now, married, busy with work, and we don't spend much time together. It felt nice to be thought of, but I honestly didn't realize how special that bottle was. At dinner, I thought it would be a nice gesture to share it. His father-in-law, Harold, was there, a man who always acted like he was above me. I placed the bottle in front of him as a gift, thinking maybe it would smooth things over between us. Harold's eyes lit up, and he took it like I'd just handed him gold. The next day, Daniel called. He asked me if I had tried the whiskey, his voice full of warmth at first. I told him I hadn't, that I had given it to Harold. There was nothing on the other end for a few seconds, and then his voice cut sharp, almost shaking. "You gave it to him?" he shouted. His anger stunned me. I stumbled, trying to explain it seemed like the right thing to do, that it was meant to be shared, but he wasn't listening. His words came heavy, filled with something I didn't yet understand. It wasn't just about the bottle. In that moment, I realized I had walked into something far deeper than I knew. Daniel and I used to be close. After his mother passed, it was just the two of us. I worked long hours at the factory, packed his school lunches, and did my best to raise him right. Back then, he'd tell me everything: school troubles, friends, dreams about leaving our small town. I always told myself that when he grew up, all those sacrifices would pay off, that he'd never forget where he came from. Things began to change when he met Emily. She was polite, always smiling, but her eyes held something else when she looked at me. She had a way of speaking that was careful, distant, as if she was guarding herself from me. At first, I thought maybe she was just shy, but over time it became clear. It wasn't shyness, it was disapproval. She treated me as though I didn't belong in the world she and Daniel were building together. Emily came from a comfortable family. Her father, Harold, was a man who liked to make his presence known. The kind who wore expensive suits even when there was no reason to. Every time we crossed paths, he'd slip in little reminders about Daniel's new life. He'd brag about the country club they went to, the vacations they took, and how lucky Daniel was to have married into such a family. His words were sharp but dressed up in smiles, the kind of comments that were meant to sting without sounding cruel. I endured it because Daniel seemed happy, and that was enough for me. But I couldn't help noticing how much further away my son drifted with each passing year. Calls grew shorter, visits became rare, and when we did meet, it felt like there was a wall between us. When the whiskey incident happened, all those buried feelings rushed back at once. Daniel's anger over that bottle wasn't just about the gift. It was the tone in his voice, the way he spoke to me as though I had failed some test. He accused me of disrespecting him, of not valuing what he had chosen for me. The words struck harder than he probably realized. I wanted to tell him I never meant to insult him, that I simply thought I was doing something kind. Instead, I stood there listening, the weight of his disappointment pressing down. It was the first time I truly felt like an outsider in my own son's life. A single mistake, and suddenly I wasn't his father anymore. I was a problem, an embarrassment. The sting of that conversation didn't fade. It lingered in my chest long after the call ended, twisting every memory of Harold's smirk and Emily's cold politeness into something sharper. For the first time, I wondered if I had already lost my son to a family that never wanted me in the first place. When Daniel raised his voice over that bottle, I could tell it wasn't just about a drink. I knew something was buried under his anger. Later that week, I found out the truth. The whiskey wasn't just a casual gift. Daniel had searched for it, paid a small fortune, and sent it because it meant something to him. It wasn't a bottle you pick up at the local store. It was rare, limited, and carefully chosen. He told me it was one of those collector's editions that people hunt for, and that he'd been excited to share it with me. His words carried a mix of pride and hurt, as if I had thrown away more than just liquor. I had tossed aside a piece of him. I didn't know how to respond. To me, whiskey was whiskey. I couldn't wrap my head around why it mattered so much, but the way he spoke, I realized this was more than a simple gift. He'd wanted it to be something we shared together. Instead, I had placed it in Harold's hands like it was nothing. That thought gnawed at me, and I decided I would at least try to make it right. I called Harold and asked, as politely as I could, if I might have the bottle back. His laughter rang through the phone before I even finished my sentence. He said something along the lines of, "Once you give a man a gift, you can't take it back. Maybe you should think twice next time." His tone was smug, almost triumphant, as if he had been waiting for this moment. That laugh stayed in my ears long after the call ended. It wasn't just about the whiskey for him either. It was about power. He enjoyed holding something that was meant for me, enjoyed knowing it would drive a wedge between me and Daniel. It was one more way of reminding me that in his world, I was always the lesser man. I wanted to explain all of this to Daniel, but when I tried, he shut me down. He didn't care about Harold's words. Instead, he told me that giving away the bottle showed I didn't value what he gave me, that I didn't take his gesture seriously. The hurt in his voice cut deeper than any insult Harold had ever thrown. I hung up that night with a weight in my chest heavier than I'd felt in years. I wasn't angry, I was ashamed. Ashamed that something meant to connect us had turned into a reason to divide us. I thought back to when Daniel was a boy, when I would save up just to buy him small things, and he'd light up with gratitude. Now here we were, grown men standing on opposite sides of a bottle, and I didn't recognize the distance between us. The days after our argument felt heavier than I expected. I thought maybe Daniel would cool down, maybe call back with a calmer tone. Instead, silence stretched between us. When he finally did reach out, it wasn't to reconcile, it was to drive the knife a little deeper. He told me plainly that I embarrassed him. His words were clipped sharp, as though he had rehearsed them. He said I didn't understand the kind of life he and Emily were building, that I couldn't see the value in the things he worked hard to provide. I reminded him, gently, that I had worked hard too, sometimes 3 shifts in a row just to make sure he had what he needed growing up. His reply was cold. "That was then, Dad. Things are different now." That line hit me harder than anything else. That was then. As if all those nights I stayed up waiting for him to get home safe from parties. All those mornings I left for work before sunrise so there'd be food on the table. None of it mattered anymore. I wasn't his father in the way I used to be. I was just the man who couldn't measure up to the Petersons. Emily never said much directly, but I could hear her in the background of his words. Her influence was there in the way he framed things, in the disdain that dripped from his voice. She had always been polite with me, but now the mask was slipping. She didn't see me as family. To her, I was a reminder of Daniel's past, the part she'd rather erase. And Harold, he didn't miss the chance to twist the knife further. At a dinner not long after, he poured glasses from that same whiskey and made a show of it. He raised his glass and joked about how some men don't know the value of a good thing when it's right in front of them. The table laughed, Daniel included. My face burned, but I swallowed it down. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. What stung the most wasn't Harold's smirk or Emily's cold glances. It was Daniel's silence. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He let them mock me, as if he agreed I was beneath them. That night I drove home alone, the sound of laughter still echoing in my ears. I thought about the boy who used to sit beside me at the kitchen table, telling me he wanted to make me proud. I wondered where that boy had gone, and who this man was who now stood by and let others tear me down. I had lost something far more precious than a bottle of whiskey. I had lost the place I once held in my son's heart. The tension only grew after that night. Every time I was around Daniel and his new family, I felt the weight of being the outsider. I tried to let it go, to tell myself that maybe things would smooth over with time, but deep down I knew they wouldn't. Harold wasn't the kind of man who let things fade. He enjoyed pressing his thumb into the wound, and the whiskey gave him just the excuse he needed. The breaking point came at another family gathering. It was supposed to be casual, a Sunday dinner at Harold and Margaret's house. I almost didn't go, but Daniel called and said it would mean a lot if I showed up. I told myself I'd endure whatever awkwardness came, because I didn't want to make things harder for my son. Harold greeted me at the door like he always did. Wide grin, strong handshake, eyes that said he was already planning the next jab. The dining room was set with polished silver, gleaming dishes, the kind of display that made me feel like I had tracked dirt into their perfect world. I took my seat at the far end of the table. When the meal began, Harold stood and walked to the cabinet. He made a little speech about special occasions and pulled out the whiskey bottle. He set it down in the middle of the table as though it were a crown jewel. Everyone leaned in with interest. I kept my eyes on my plate, hoping he'd pour his drinks and be done with it. But of course, Harold couldn't resist. He looked right at me as he uncorked it. "Now this here," he said loudly, "isn't just any bottle. This was gifted to me, and I have to say it was quite the surprise. Not every day you get handed something so fine by your daughter's father-in-law." The room chuckled. Emily smiled politely, but Daniel actually laughed. My stomach twisted. Harold poured himself a generous glass, then passed it around like he was sharing a prize. He even toasted to understanding the value of a good gift. It was a direct jab, and everyone knew it. I felt the heat climb up my neck. My hands tightened on the edge of my chair. For years I had swallowed moments like these, telling myself it was better to keep the peace. But as Harold smirked and raised his glass, I realized peace wasn't what he wanted. He wanted to remind me over and over that I was beneath him. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he just clinked glasses with Harold and took a sip. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to sit quietly anymore. I wasn't going to let Harold play king at my expense while my son pretended not to notice. For the first time, I decided I'd fight back. After that dinner, I drove home in silence, the road stretching out in front of me like it had no end. My chest ached, not just from humiliation, but from something heavier, resolve. I realized then that Harold would never stop unless I made him. He thrived on keeping me small, and Daniel would never see it for what it was unless I showed him. I didn't want violence. I didn't want to scream or throw punches. That wasn't who I was. But there are other ways to fight. Harold was proud, too proud. He loved his money, his status, the way people in town looked up to him. If I was going to get through to my son, it had to be by knocking Harold down from that pedestal he'd built for himself. I started by listening. Harold talked too much, especially when he drank. At those dinners, he'd boast about cutting corners in his construction company, about how he knew the right people to get permits signed without inspections. People would laugh, thinking he was being charming, but I heard the cracks in his pride. I remembered one story in particular, how he'd bragged about skipping safety checks on a new housing project to save money. I tucked that detail away like a weapon. The next step was quiet work. I stopped by one of Harold's job sites, pretending it was just out of curiosity. I struck up conversations with the workers. Most of them were polite, but a few were eager to vent. They talked about late paychecks, about being told to keep quiet when materials didn't meet code, about corners cut so badly they feared accidents. I didn't push too hard, I just let them talk. People reveal plenty if you give them space. One man, older and tired-looking, told me Harold had been skimming off contracts for years. "Everyone knows it," he said, "but nobody wants to cross him." I nodded, kept my expression calm, though inside my heart pounded. I was starting to piece together the truth. At night, I began writing things down, dates, names, details from conversations. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it all, but I knew one thing. I would use Harold's own arrogance against him. Meanwhile, Daniel and Emily called less and less. When they did, their tone was clipped, as though they were tolerating me. Emily even suggested, not too subtly, that maybe it was better if I didn't come to every family gathering. The more they pushed me out, the more determined I became. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just an old man who didn't belong in their polished world. What they didn't know was that I had learned how to survive long before Harold ever came into the picture. And now, survival meant fighting back with the only weapon I had, truth. The chance to use what I'd gathered came sooner than I expected. Emily organized another dinner at her parents' house, and though part of me wanted to refuse, I agreed. Something told me it was the right moment. I walked into that house not as the quiet man who had endured Harold's taunts, but as someone with a plan. The table looked the same as always, polished, perfect, full of dishes that screamed wealth and taste. Harold sat at the head, commanding attention like a king on his throne. Emily and Daniel were close by, glowing in their place beside him. I found my usual spot at the far end, the place they always seemed to push me toward. But this time I didn't mind. I had something Harold didn't know I carried. Dinner started as it usually did, with Harold telling stories that painted him as clever and untouchable. He bragged about a new contract his company had landed, how much money he saved by streamlining the process. The others chuckled and nodded, though they didn't really understand what he meant. I did. I'd heard those words before. I waited until he finished, then leaned forward. My voice was calm, but it cut through the chatter. "Harold," I said, "did you streamline that contract the same way you did with those houses near Riverbend?" The ones where you skipped the safety inspections. The table went quiet. Forks paused midair. Harold's smile faltered for the first time since I'd known him. He tried to laugh it off. Oh, you must have heard some rumor. People like to talk. But I didn't let him off. Funny, because I spoke to a few of your workers. They didn't sound like rumors to me. They sounded like men who were worried about their jobs, and about the people living in those houses. Daniel turned to me, confusion on his face. Dad, what are you talking about? I kept my eyes on Harold. I'm talking about the money he schemes, the way he keeps his profits high by putting families at risk, the way he cuts corners and hides it under charm. Harold's jaw tightened. He snapped. You don't know what you're saying. But the flush creeping up his neck betrayed him. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering. Emily's face was pale. For years, I had sat at that table and let him mock me. But now it was his turn to squirm. Every detail I'd collected poured out of me in steady, measured words. Late paychecks. Inferior materials. Workers told to stay silent. Each piece landed like a stone, chipping away at the shiny image he'd built. Daniel sat frozen, staring at Harold as though seeing him for the first time. Harold tried to regain control, raising his voice, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted in everyone at that table. And for once, it wasn't me who looked small, it was him. After that dinner, the room broke apart in uneasy silence. No one knew where to look. Plates of food sat untouched, the smell of roast and butter filling the air like it was mocking the moment. Harold tried to laugh it off again, but no one joined him this time. Emily fussed with her napkin, her face drained of color. Daniel just stared at me, his expression unreadable. When the evening wound down, I left before the others. I didn't want to stay long enough to give Harold a chance to regain his footing. I walked out of that house with my head higher than it had been in years, but the victory felt incomplete. I didn't know where Daniel stood, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. 2 days later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Daniel was standing there alone. His tie was loose, his eyes tired, as if he hadn't slept much since that night. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked if he could come in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he had once done his homework, where we had eaten dinners just the two of us after his mother passed. He ran his hands over the wood grain like he was trying to remember those days. Finally, he said, Dad, what you said, is it true? I didn't rush my answer. I just looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't the boy I raised anymore, but I saw pieces of that boy in his eyes. Pieces buried under years of distance and Harold's shadow. I told him everything, plain and simple. The workers I'd spoken to, the details I'd written down, the way Harold laughed when I asked for the whiskey back. I laid it out without anger, just truth. Daniel leaned back, his jaw tightening. Emily says you were trying to humiliate him. She says you twisted his words. His voice cracked slightly at the end. He wanted to believe her, but doubt was already creeping in. I shook my head. I don't need to twist Harold's words. He's proud of what he does. He tells on himself every time he opens his mouth. The room was quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands and let out a long breath. I always thought you were stuck in the past, that you couldn't understand the life Emily and I were building. But now, I don't know. I leaned forward, my voice steady. Daniel, I've never wanted anything but to see you happy. I worked myself to the bone to give you a chance at life. And when I see you turning cold to me, siding with people who mock me, it cuts deeper than you realize. I didn't care about the whiskey. It was you I cared about. You and me, sharing something together. That's what I thought family was supposed to be. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time in years I saw guilt in his eyes. His shoulders slumped, as if he was carrying the weight of every choice that had led him here. I thought Harold was someone I should look up to, he admitted quietly. I thought he represented success. But maybe I was blind. I didn't press him. I just sat with him in that silence, giving him room to let it sink in. For years I had been the one left outside, unwanted at the table. But now, in my own kitchen, Daniel was the one realizing where he belonged, and where he didn't. The conversation with Daniel gave me hope, but it didn't solve everything. Truth never lands smoothly in a family that's already split. A few days after he came to my house, Emily called me herself. Her voice was cold, sharp, each word deliberate. I don't know what you think you accomplished, Robert, she said. But humiliating my father in front of everyone? That was cruel. You've crossed a line. I didn't argue. I let her speak, though each sentence came like a blade. She told me I had twisted stories, that I was bitter and jealous. She insisted Harold was a respected man, that he had built everything with his own 2 hands, and I should be grateful my son was part of their family. Her words told me everything I needed to know. Emily would never turn against her father. To her, Harold was the foundation, the example, the man whose approval mattered most. If it came down to choosing between me and Harold, I already knew which way she'd lean. Later that evening, Daniel called again. This time, his voice was torn weary. "Emily's furious, Dad," he admitted. "She says you're trying to tear the family apart. She wants me to cut ties with you for good." I stayed quiet for a moment before answering. "And what do you want, Daniel?" The silence on his end spoke volumes. I could almost hear the tug-of-war inside him. On one side, his wife and her father, the polished family with money and influence. On the other side, me, his old man, living in a small house, carrying years of sweat and sacrifice. "Dad," he said finally, "I don't know. You put me in an impossible position." "No, son," I told him softly. "Harold put you in that position. All I did was tell the truth." The days that followed were filled with tension. Emily stopped answering my calls altogether, and Daniel grew more distant again. But I could sense the crack forming in their marriage. Daniel had seen something he couldn't unsee, and Emily's fierce loyalty to Harold only deepened his doubts. The breaking point came at another gathering, smaller this time, just Emily, Daniel, Harold, and me. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Daniel insisted, wanting to mend things. Harold sat smug as always, pretending nothing had changed. Emily stayed glued to his side, her hand gripping his arm like a declaration of loyalty. When Harold made another veiled remark about people who don't understand real success, Emily laughed along, but Daniel didn't. His face tightened. He turned to her and asked, "Do you even hear yourself? Do you hear him?" Emily looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about? He's just making a point." "No," Daniel snapped louder this time. "He's been putting my father down for years, and you let him. You join him. And I let it happen." The room froze. Harold tried to brush it off, but Daniel didn't let him. He stood, shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep choosing silence. If you can't respect my father, then you don't respect me either." Emily's face hardened. "So that's it? You're taking his side?" Daniel looked at me, his eyes tired but firm. "It's not sides, Emily. It's right and wrong." In that moment, I saw my son again, the boy I raised, the one who once promised he'd always stand by me. And I knew Harold's grip on him was slipping. The weeks after that confrontation felt different. The balance had shifted. Harold wasn't as loud as before, though his pride kept him from admitting defeat. Emily barely spoke to me anymore, her words clipped and icy when she did. But Daniel, something in him had changed. He was quieter, more thoughtful, like a man piecing together a puzzle he'd ignored for too long. News about Harold began to spread. A local paper ran a story on his construction projects, raising questions about safety violations. Someone had tipped them off. I never admitted to Daniel that it was me who handed over the notes I'd collected, the conversations I'd written down, the workers' names. I didn't need to. Watching Harold's carefully built image start to crumble was enough. At family gatherings, people whispered instead of laughed at Harold's jokes. Clients pulled out of deals. Inspectors showed up at job sites. His smug grin faded, replaced by short tempers and long silences. Emily stood by him, still fiercely loyal, but I could see the cracks forming in her perfect posture. The empire she believed in was no longer untouchable. Daniel came by my house one evening after work. He sat at the same kitchen table again, shoulders heavy, face pale. "Dad," he said quietly, "everything you said, it's true. I've been blind. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I just nodded and let him speak." He admitted that he'd chosen Harold's approval over mine, thinking it meant success, thinking it was the future he wanted. But seeing Harold unravel had shown him the truth, that respect built on lies and cruelty wasn't respect at all. We sat in silence for a long time, the way men sometimes do when words aren't enough. Finally, Daniel said, "I should have defended you. I let them make you feel small, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." The bottle of whiskey never came back to me. Harold drank it dry, no doubt clinging to it like one last victory. But I didn't care anymore. That bottle wasn't the real prize. What mattered was that the mask Harold wore had slipped, and Daniel finally saw him for what he was. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic showdown. It was simple, letting truth do the work Harold thought he was too smart to be caught by. Watching him lose his shine, watching Daniel walk away from his shadow, that was enough. I didn't win my son back completely that night, but I felt the first steps of something real. For years I thought I had lost him to a family that never wanted me. But betrayal, as painful as it was, had opened his eyes. And I realized I didn't need whiskey to bond with my son. I only needed the truth. And in the end, that was the strongest drink of all. So what do you think? Was I wrong for exposing Harold the way I did? Or was it the only way to finally open my son's eyes? Should I have stayed quiet and tried to keep the peace? Or did Harold deserve exactly what came to him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear your take on this. And if you enjoy stories like mine, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one.